So, yesterday we had different notions already on the 2030 agenda on sustainable development. And there it became very clear, and it was already clear to most of us, that this is a highly ambitious vision for global sustainable development for the whole world, be it the global south, be it the global north. However, this ambitious agenda with about 169 targets in 17 goals, of course, requires a lot of funding. Currently, the UN system speaks about 5 to 8 trillions. There are other figures around, but they are, whether they are a little bit higher or smaller, they are huge. So it is about from billions to trillions. And when we look at currently the ODI expenditures we have for development in developing and transition countries, then we have just 135 billion US dollars a year. So having said that, it is quite clear that ODI is not in the position to be the funding partner, the main funding partner for the implementation of the Agenda 2030. So in that respect, it is quite clear when the public sector is not capable to jump in or to assume the responsibility, then that the private sector becomes a major role in getting the Agenda 2030 funded. So, however, the big question is also how this can be done, how private and public funding can come together and provide leverage to each other. But there are also, of course, some risks in that. As a second point of consideration, we have also to see that, namely also developing and transition countries, that they are in charge also of raising their funds, of making available funding, maybe through better tax collection systems, or also the private sector, the multinational corporations, who are also called upon to look that taxing on the spot where production happens is fair and does happen at all. Okay, I think also the financial system in general has to do some homework, the financial markets, that they are joining the efforts and that they are not jeopardizing all the efforts from the other actors. Having said that, I would like to welcome Michael Gerber. I owe you a great thanks. He got yesterday the message whether he could jump in and to provide us a certain idea about what's going on in New York, but also worldwide regarding financing for development. Michael Gerber, he is a philosopher and studied also history and social anthropology here in Bern, and he is the special envoyee and the lead negotiator. He was the lead negotiator for the 2030 agenda and the Addis Ababa action agenda 2 years ago. Okay, with that, I would like to call on Michael to give us an impression on what all it is about and on what is going behind the scenes. Thank you very much for coming and being with us. Michael.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for your kind introduction. Indeed, it is the same for me as for you, Thomas. I haven't had a lot of preparation time, but it's an honor, of course, to jump in for Klaus Töpfer, whom I estimate very much. Of course, it's impossible for me to replace him. I would actually also have preferred to listen to him than to listen to myself, as you can imagine. I have heard myself speaking quite often. But anyway, I hope you won't be disappointed. I will try to give you kind of an overview. You've already heard quite a lot. I will start with the figures and then try to dive a little bit into the discussions at global level. not only New York, but at global level. Referring to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, of course, but also the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, Financing for Development, or the term I prefer, Financing for Sustainable Development. This requires a paradigm change, and I would like to show you how we see that, or how we look at this. Well, I would like to start where Thomas stopped with the number, the figure 5 to 7 trillion per year in global investment that is needed to achieve the SDGs by 2030. Investment needs in developing countries amount to about 3.9 trillion US dollars per year on average. This mainly refers to investments in basic infrastructure, so roads, rail and ports, power stations, water and sanitation, food security, agriculture, rural development, climate change mitigation and adaptation, health and education. At the current levels, investment in SDG-relevant sectors, developing countries alone face an annual gap of 2.5 trillion US dollars. So bridging such a gap may seem a daunting task, but it is achievable, and I would like to show you today how this can be achieved. First, I would like to state clearly that the 2030 Agenda is not an agenda of or for development cooperation anymore, like the Mdgs were seen for. Not only in terms of scope, they are different, because, I mean, it's a universal agenda with many global challenges to be addressed in many different thematic fields, so the thematic breadth of the agenda is huge compared to any other development agenda we've known before. It's an integrated agenda, so goals and targets are interlinked. We can't work in silos anymore, as we were also used to in the past in development cooperation. But it's also, in terms of financing, of course, a different story with the 2030 Agenda. Thomas already referred to it. The official development assistance, ODA, reached a new peak last year, 142.6 billion US dollar, and can never make up for the 3.9 trillion that are needed in order to support developing countries. Aid spent on refugees in donor countries rose last year, so a lot of the means available for official development assistance is now staying in donor countries and supporting refugees where they arrive after they have left home. But still, the costs and the ODA rose according to the official data collected by the OECD, the Development Assistance Committee, by 7.1% to the year before, even if you strip out refugee costs. But anyway, if you look to the total amount needed, we can calculate it easily. It's only about 4% official development assistance can make up of the total amount needed. So second, we need other and new finance flows to be tapped, and therefore a paradigm shift is needed. Let's have a look at ODA first. What is it meant to be and what purpose does it serve? For many years and decades, I would say, the common understanding and claim was that ODA has to be increased and become more effective. And I think that's still the mantra we are hearing from many actors in that field. The slogan nowadays is or you have an addition to this slogan in recent years, that ODA also has to leverage additional private investment. And that's where we are at the moment. ODA is actually a term that was coined in the Development Assistance Committee, the DAC of the OECD, to measure aid. The DAC first used the term in 1969. And ever since, it is widely used as an indicator of international aid flow, including some loans. The historical beginnings of ODA are actually the development activities in the colonial powers in their overseas territories, the institutions and programs for economic cooperation created under the United Nations auspices after the Second World War, and the United States' large-scale support for economic stability in the countries on the periphery of the communist bloc of that era. The success of the Marshall Plan created considerable and perhaps excessive optimism about the prospects for helping poorer countries in quite different circumstances through external assistance. So in 1969, the DAC adopted this official development assistance concept, the ODA concept. It stated that ODA are those official transactions which are made with the main objective of promoting the economic and social development of developing countries and the financial terms of which are intended to be concessional in character. 1 year later, there was a publication of the so-called Pearson Commission, and that commission included a recommendation for 0.7% for official development assistance measured along the gross national income of a donor country. And this 0.7 target that you certainly all know was adopted by the UN already in 1970. So it's quite an old concept. We still use it. We still aren't there. 1972, in that year, the DAC agreed on a firmer definition of ODA, and it included the actors who are meant to come up with the funds, so state and local governments, executive agencies, and it made clear that concessional in character, the funds have to be concessional in character and contain at least a grant element of 25%. So it become a bit more differentiated. But it's still a concept that is one for donor countries supporting developing countries, to put it bluntly. Today, I think we really have to think beyond aid, and beyond aid by the traditional donor countries and their ODA shares. There are so-called non-traditional donors out there, and they already provide a significant proportion of modern public financing for development, so far not officially acknowledged as ODA by the DAC, the Development Assistance Committee. Take Saudi Arabia, for example. They spent last year 2% of GNI on development assistance. Of course, with other principles behind the concept they use, but still, it's a significant proportion, I would say. The United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and other Gulf countries also exceeded the 1% target in the last years. South-South cooperation becomes more relevant. For example, in the case of Chinese development activities in Africa, or the cooperation among BRIC states. And the private sector has widely been absent in all these donor discussions for decades. They were mentioned, of course, the private flows were mentioned already in the 60s, 70s in the OECD. They were referred to for many years in many regards, but they weren't part of the discussion. Until Busan, the Busan Partnership Agreement 2011. There, the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation was founded, established to help ensure accountability for implementation of the commitments made already in Paris 2005, in Accra 2008, etc. These high-level meetings organized and headed by the OECD. There, in this partnership, you have specific private actors also being part of the discussion. But until then, they were absent, I would say, in general. Likewise, the firm definition of ODA is no longer adequate to grasp all the relevant financial flows conducive to development in partner countries of international cooperation, I would say. And as I mentioned in the beginning, ODA can only contribute a minor share to the total investment needed to achieve the SDGs. Therefore, the OECD has proposed a new measure entitled Total Official Support for Sustainable Development, TOST in short. TOST is a means to modernize the DAX statistical measurement framework to promote incentives for mobilizing and catalyzing development finance and to reflect the broader range of funding options now available to developing countries. TOST shall cover all officially supported resource flows regardless of the financial instrument used or level of concessionality or whether they are delivered through bilateral or multilateral channels. But we have to keep in mind, TOST is just a measure. It is not a financial source or a financial flow or the like, nor does it replace any other measure or finance instrument. Coming back to ODA, despite its shortcomings, the concept of ODA has proven quite successful in many ways. First, it mobilized action in many OECD countries as they entered into a kind of a competition among themselves when being measured and compared. Second, with this 0.7% target and respective political commitments, donor countries have a moral and political responsibility to reach this target one day. It is not clear when, but one day. Third, in growing economies, ODA tends to permanently grow in real terms if it is really attributed to a specific percentage of the GNI, like it is the case in Switzerland, once the parliament set the target of 0.5. So with a growing economy, the real funding for ODA will normally grow as well. The GNI attribution also helps to hold parliaments to stick to a specific target. And last but not least, fifth point or aspect, for developing countries, especially the least developing countries, the 0.7 target gives them some kind of predictability that development assistance will continue to grow as long as the target is not met. They can hold donors to account for their commitments. That's what they actually do all the time in international discussions. In addition, ODA was the ideal concept corresponding to the global framework of the Millennium Development Goals introduced in 2000. The Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, you remember, they originated from the UN Millennium Declaration. They set 8 global goals, concrete targets and indicators for poverty reduction in order to achieve the rights set forth in the declaration. MDG 8 specifically focused on the global partnership and the means to reach all goals, mainly through the provision of ODA. In general, the MDGs focused on achievements of international development cooperation in poor countries, rather than development successes in a broader sense. They were never negotiated. They were just presented by experts, by UN experts. Of course, there were discussions beforehand, also in the OECD, but this fact was responsible that it took years, for Switzerland 4 to 5 years, until it was acknowledged as an orientation framework for development cooperation. But the MDGs, they did kickstart a new UN process called Financing for Development. That process was launched and a series of high-level international conferences were held. In 2002, the International Conference on Financing for Development in Monterrey, Mexico, was the first UN-sponsored summit-level meeting to address key financial issues pertaining to global development. That conference succeeded in placing financing for development, and thus the achievement of the MDGs, firmly on the global agenda. The outcome of the conference, the Monterrey Consensus, reflected a landmark global agreement between developed and developing countries, in which both recognized their responsibilities in key areas such as trade, aid, debt relief, and institution building. In 2008, there was a follow-up international conference on financing for development to review the implementation of the Monterrey Consensus in Doha, in Qatar. That declaration reaffirmed the Monterrey Consensus, and the challenge for the Doha agenda was to solidify the vague objectives of the Monterrey Consensus a few years before, and to put them into more concrete commitments. In view of the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs, the UN member states agreed in 2014 to hold a third international conference on financing for development in July 2015 in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. And still before the 2030 Agenda was adopted a few months later in September that same year. This agreement, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, was reached by 193 UN member states and really provides now a foundation for implementing the 2030 Agenda that world leaders subsequently adopted in the same year. In support of the SDGs, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda contains more than 100 concrete measures. It addresses all sources of finance, and it covers cooperation on a range of issues, including technology, science, innovation, trade, and capacity building. Domestic resource mobilization is central to the Addis Agenda. In the outcome document, countries agreed to an array of measures aimed at widening their revenue base, improving tax collection, and combating tax evasion and illicit financial flows. You will hear Dina Pomeranz on that specific topic of tax collection and reforming tax systems. Countries also reaffirmed their commitment to ODA, particularly for the least developed countries, and pledged to increase South-South cooperation. But the outcome document also underscores the importance of aligning private investment with sustainable development, along with public policies and regulatory frameworks to set the right incentives. A new mechanism that shall facilitate financing for new technologies for developing countries was also agreed upon. The Addis Ababa Action Agenda includes important policy commitments and key deliverables in critical areas for sustainable development, including infrastructure, social protection, and technology. Despite the fact that we still speak about financing for development, with the Addis Agenda, the scope of financing was clearly widened, including all financial flows, potentially fostering sustainable development in its broad and integrated sense of the 2030 Agenda. The 2030 Agenda does call for a paradigm shift in the way we, private and public actors, do business. With the Addis Agenda, we finally have the legitimate basis negotiated and adopted by 193 UN member states to enforce this paradigm shift, also in terms of financing for sustainable development. So, ladies and gentlemen, the 2030 Agenda requires the mobilization of a wide array of domestic and international resources from both public and private actors. ODA will remain a crucial part of international development cooperation, there's no doubt, particularly for countries most in need. ODA in these countries still makes up more than 2/3 of external finance, and the DAC is pushing for it to better be used as a lever to generate private investment and domestic tax revenues, and in turn to help achieve the SDGs. But in order to achieve the SDGs by 2030, a much stronger role for finance beyond ODA, as I mentioned, including private capital, is needed. So again, 5 to 7 trillion per year in global investment needs to achieve the SDG. 3.9 trillions for developing countries. Structurally weak economies need special attention. UNCTAD estimates that a doubling of the growth rate of private investment in the least developed countries is required. Now, if you look at this graph again, you see the largest share of investment actually is supposed to come from the private sector. So it is added here. To close this gap of 2.5 trillion, there is a high potential and role for the business sector. I often hear statements that the private sector is now only asked to fill this gap because the public sector is not able to come up with the necessary funds to finance the SDGs. But that's not the point, ladies and gentlemen. With the 2030 Agenda, world leaders agreed on a global transformation towards sustainable development, which is only possible if we all start to act. Business Business as usual is not an option. The private sector is not asked to just raise funds and investment in order to finance a public global agenda. No, it has another role, and I see at least 3 fields of action in which I deem business engagement absolutely pivotal. First, companies have to take corporate, social, and environmental responsibility. So you all know these frameworks and principles which are out there: CSR, business and human rights principles, global compact principles, principles for responsible investment, etc. Second point, private-public partnerships, multi-stakeholder partnerships have to be boosted. They give the possibility to pool risks and resources to address systemic challenges, since public sector is on board, and to really make a difference. Third point, investment in SDG relevant sectors, where there are huge business opportunities. Sustainability can mean business, and vice versa. There is an example of 4 sectors that were identified by the Business and Sustainable Development Commission. That's a commission that consists of many global leaders, CEOs, which came together this year, or no, before, but published a report called Better Business, Better World this year. I quote from that report: achieving the global goals creates at least $12 trillion opportunities by 2030 in food and agriculture, cities, energy and materials, as well as health and well-being alone, in these 4 sectors. And here you see many different areas or subsectors with indication on the potential, the quantitative potential of business opportunities. That's what they found. Sustainable development has to become part of the core business of companies. That's the point. There is a business case in sustainability. Take the clean tech sector, for example. It is an important contribution to sustainable development while companies making profit. Nobody asks companies to just pay for the SDGs, for example, by increasing their philanthropic contributions or the like. What we need is a serious business engagement for sustainable development, seizing win-win opportunities, making profit while at the same time contributing to a better world. Thus, transformation does not mean to keep doing the same, but with more money. Real transformation starts with changing paradigms, and paradigm shift means to do things different, to change minds and patterns we are used to. This mind change concerns all of us, of course. But in the context of financing sustainable development, one important aspect is to rethink the patterns we are used to when making investments. And Thomas Proy already mentioned it or referred to it. That's why the finance sector is crucial. The current global financial system is unstable, it is decoupled from the real economy, and it's not working in line with the ambitious goals of the 2030 Agenda. This is a finding of the UNEP inquiry that has worked for many years, really looking at the failures of the finance system in place. There is a huge potential to change this. Take the amounts that are being managed in this sector. Banks manage financial assets of $140 trillion. Institutional investors manage assets in the order of $100 trillion. And capital markets, including bonds and equities, exceed $100 trillion as well. So there is actually no need for more money. In Switzerland, we know more than 220 institutions having managed approximately 266 billion Swiss francs in the field of sustainable finance last year. 266 billion Swiss francs. Since 2005, this volume has increased every year by 28% on average. Today, sustainable investment funds currently account for 7% of the total fund market in Switzerland. This is still a niche, of course, but it is steadily gaining ground. 3 years ago, it was 4 or 5%, so we are at 7 now. These trends are very positive, I believe. However, the complexity of the sustainable finance landscape is also growing. An increasing number of actors use a variety of instruments to invest in sustainable companies. You have funds with ESG criteria, environmental social governance criteria. Actually, 85% of all the funds I mentioned in Switzerland fulfill ESG criteria, but the way they are applied varies, of course. Then you have green bonds, you have social impact bonds, you have impact investment, where the definition is also not very clear what impact we mean, but still it is a real movement. There is venture philanthropy, etc., etc. Nowadays, there are so many of these models, of these so-called blended finance instruments and platforms. But I really deem this an interesting approach that has the potential to attract new sources of funding to the biggest global challenges. Blended finance is the strategic use of public or private funds, including concessional tools, to mobilize additional capital flows, public and or private, to specifically emerging and frontier markets. I give you an example of Swiss engagement. In Latin America, the Swiss International Corporation increasingly works with social entrepreneurs, and it has recently started to support a platform called Social Impact Incentives, SIINC. The business model here is to grant premium payments to high-impact organizations based on verified social outcomes. With this approach, real impact is incentivized and linked to an organization's profitability. A company thus becomes more attractive for investors. So you see there, this incentive contribution is done by the platform, the SINC, if it is deemed a high potential for social impact. And with this, it becomes more attractive to increase financial return and social return at the same time. I know I have time is running, and I will conclude in a minute. So, yes, to conclude with, I would just make my following main messages once again. The role of official development assistance, ODA, in financing the SDGs remains indispensable, that's clear, in particular for least developed countries. However, with the adoption of the 2030 Agenda and the Addis Agenda, the international community has acknowledged the need for significant additional development finance beyond aid, and therefore accorded a prominent place to private sector participation. The vision underpinning the 2030 Agenda is broad and it's ambitious, calling for an equally broad and ambitious financing strategy. The SDGs will require a real step change in the levels of both public and private investment in all countries. Traditional donors should make use of the manifold and innovative finance instruments in order to boost their impact. Private and public actors have to overcome traditional barriers to cooperate. They have to join forces, work together, include other actors like civil society, science, etc., and blend their financing patterns. Sustainability has to become a business case. Science, academia can provide evidence for the development of new financing instruments, and they can stimulate action to address trade-offs and to seize synergies in the field of sustainable development finance. Only if we mobilize action and finance to shift paradigms, the SDGs will mean a real global transformation. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael Gerber, for giving us the insights and also some key figures and what is on the horizon. Given to time limitations, I would suggest that questions would then just be raised through the Slido or by raising hands afterwards. Now I would like to welcome Dina Pomeranz. Dina Pomeranz has been, is an assistant professor, in economics at the University of Zurich. Previously, she has been working in Harvard and at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where she is still a member of the Poverty Action Lab at the MIT. Her main focus areas of research are about taxation and public procurement. We are listening to your speech and look forward. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a big pleasure for me to come to this institute in Bern that I heard a lot about. We are at the University of Zurich now, also building a center for development, so I hope there will be many more opportunities for collaboration between our institutions. So I'm going to take a bit of a deep dive in one aspect of the financing that we just heard about, which is taxation, which is my personal area of research. A lot of times when I talk to people about work on development or developing countries, taxation is not even something that comes to mind. Many times people in the north have this idea that countries in the south are just sitting there waiting for aid to come in or investment to come in or something falling out of the sky, but actually countries more and more are raising their own revenues, and I, in my research, work very closely with the tax authorities in Kenya and Chile and Ecuador to see together how tax collections can be improved. So I'm going to share a little bit some general data about what tax collection looks like in developing countries, and then discuss a few of the solutions that we have been trying out with different governments. So developing countries tend to have much lower tax rates compared to GDP than rich countries. So it's not just that they have less revenue, but for each dollar of production, economic production in the country, the taxes collected are lower. This comes in the combination of all these needs that we just heard Michael talk about. So there's a lot of needs for investment in infrastructure and in social programs. Is there a feedback in the microphone, or can people hear me fine? Okay, great. So then obviously the thought comes to mind: wouldn't it be easy just collect more taxes, and this would solve many of those problems? While this is something I deeply believe in, therefore I work in this sector, I'm going to show you that it's maybe not as simple as that. Okay, so overall, first let's take a look at the world map. Where in the world are taxes particularly high? Everyone knows sort of Europe tends to have higher tax rates, Switzerland being a little bit of an exception there. But when you look at the big picture, you see more or less the richer countries tend to be darker green, which means a higher rate of tax collection compared to their GDP. And the whitest countries here are mostly in Africa. So that obviously is a constraint on development because the government, if the government wants to help with the development construction, they have very limited resources. Here you can also see a different way to show this. So here on the horizontal axis you see GDP, the reverse. On the vertical axis up, you see GDP, so higher countries are richer, and across you see the tax share. So as you can see, it kind of slopes up. So you have Denmark on the top right there, and you have the Central African Republic at the bottom left. It's not a one-on-one relationship though. As you can see also, there are a lot of choices within a government. For a given level of development, you have some countries that have much higher tax collection compared to GDP. This is partially a political decision and partially a decision, an issue of capability of actually raising the tax. This is not something that is only limited to countries in Africa or in Latin America or in Asia. As you can see here, we have rich countries today. 100 years ago, they also started at very low levels of tax collection for very similar reasons. So here we have France in blue, Sweden, United Kingdom in United States, and around 1920, they all had tax rates between 10 and 15% of GDP, which is where many of the developing countries are today. Another big picture number I wanted to show you is kind of how do taxes compare to other flows that we often talk about when we're talking about financing for development. So on the top left, you see the low-income countries. On the bottom right, you see the middle-income countries. So first thing to note is in the middle-income countries, obviously aid is a smaller part, but the scales here are very different. Right? Everything is much bigger when you middle-income countries because there are more middle-income countries and they are richer, and this is the total. But tax revenue by far dwarfed official development assistance that we just talked a lot about, foreign direct investments, and remittances by immigrants who send money back. Okay, so those countries already, taxes is the key part of financing. Now, in low-income countries, it's a bit different. In low-income countries, the gray official development assistance is of similar proportions as tax revenue. So that's where also the international influence is therefore much bigger, and countries have an interest to maybe change a little bit that balance, so they're less dependent on foreign assistance. And you also see that remittances, so payments from migrants abroad, for example, from Switzerland, who send money back to their country, plays proportionally a much bigger role in low-income countries. Okay, so many reasons why many governments therefore are trying to increase their tax collection, but it's a big challenge. So here's just a few of the reasons why this is challenging. So as you know, many of these countries have a large informal sector, so how is the government even going to tax people where there's no information about their revenue is a very big challenge. So this means there is a small tax base. That means there's a small number of firms or entities who are actually contributing to tax payments. So now the government has a tendency, obviously, to say, okay, we know you, now we're going to tax you, right? By the way, it's not just a developing country problem. In Italy, very similar problems, that you have a small number of firms or entities that end up paying a very high % of tax because everyone else pays very little. And that can actually be a big problem for development, because now you have the successful firms or international firms who are visible, who are growing, who are now burdened with a lot of taxes. So it actually is attractive for a firm to kind of stay small, to stay under the radar, so as to not attract the attention of the government, which goes against many of the development goals. So there's a trade-off there. So that's why it's also very important that governments can expand the tax base so that more and more individuals and firms start contributing, even if it's in a small part, to that revenue. Also, there are hypotheses, we know relatively little empirically if that's true, but there are hypotheses that say that as more and more people contribute to the tax, they feel more ownership of the government and more rights to claim better management, and so potentially including more people in that could also include governments. It's an area under a lot of research that it would be interesting to learn more about. So a third point is obviously a political economy of increasing taxes on the relatively rich. That is not at all limited to developing countries. We see in the United States how tax rates for the rich people are going down, even though inequality is going up. So all countries have that challenge, that raising money on the rich is difficult politically because these exact same people have a lot of power. A fourth limitation is just fiscal, technical know-how and knowledge, and organizational capacity. So as governments generally obtain more capacity and tertiary and secondary education levels in countries rise and tax officials become more and more competent, this will also help a lot with that. And finally, as we talked that there is an informal sector, but even in the formal sector, it's often very hard to tax entities because a lot of the transactions are not recorded on a paper trail. So there's no proof that you had any revenue, and so the government can't enforce it. So this is the area where I have worked a lot with governments to see how they can improve that margin, because now with modern technology, it becomes easier and easier for governments to collect more and more information. There's a lot of hope that this type of information collection can facilitate tax collection. So I'm going to tell you about two studies that I did. The first one is one that we did together with the government of Chile. And this is about the value-added tax. So for background, let me give you a little bit of information of why the value-added tax is interesting here. So the value-added tax, most countries in the world now have one, so you're all familiar. So it's a tax where you pay taxes not on your total sales, but on the value added, which means on the sales minus the input cost. So to deduct that input cost, I need to ask a receipt from the firm I bought it from, right? So if I sell something to Michael and I buy something from a supplier. Now if Michael wants to deduct what I sold to him from his value-added tax, he needs to ask me for a receipt. Right now, in Michael's books, there is proof that Dina had sales. And if I now go to the government and the government has those books and I say, oh, sorry, the business was bad, I had no revenue, they can say, well, but we know you had at least this. And if you imagine everyone in this room had a book like that and the government can collect this information, they can add them all up and they can say, hey, we know there's at least $5,000 in revenue that we have because other people have deducted from their value-added tax $5,000 in input costs that they say they bought from you. And so that's why there's this idea that the value-added tax has this so-called self-enforcing property in which, because of this incentive of the firms to ask receipts of each other, they enforce compliance on each other. So this is the hypothesis that we were trying to study together with the government of Chile. Now notice, here there are these incentives to ask a receipt. Firm 2 buys something from firm 1, ask for a receipt for the deduction. Firm 3, same thing, ask for a receipt of firm 2. Now, where this breaks down is the final consumer, right? You go to a store, you buy a pack of chocolate, you don't need to deduct anything, so therefore, you don't ask for a receipt, so potentially there's no paper trail of that final transaction. So that's what we tested. So we did a randomized experiment where the government of Chile sent 100,000 letters to firms telling them that they are under special observation. And then we compared the behavior of those firms to firms that did not receive the letter. And so we found very striking results. So these are the transactions from one firm to another. And these are the transactions from the firm sales to the final consumer. So you see that when they were told they're under observation, the margin where they improved, it's almost all on that part that didn't have already this automatically built-in self-enforcement by their client firms. So this was very encouraging. Okay, in Chile this works great. Clearly the value-added tax and the paper trail have a big potential to help tax compliance. Now, I don't know how much many of you know about Chile, but it's a little bit like Switzerland of Latin America in that compliance rates are generally high, corruption rates are generally low. The tax authority has a very good reputation in the country. Everyone is terrified that if they cheat, they will be caught, right? So the question is, can we just flip this thing on in other countries around the world? And that's where we did another study with the government of Ecuador, and turns out, to no surprise to anyone in this room, development is complicated. Things are not flipped on like a light switch. This is probably the result of 30 years of value-added tax enforcement in Chile that ends like this. And hopefully Ecuador will look like this too in 10 or 20 years. But here's what happened when Ecuador started. So Ecuador recently acquired this capability to do this massive cross-check of everyone's receipts in the room. It's actually quite computationally intensive. So they did this cross-check for all firms on the revenue, and they checked which firms have the largest discrepancy between what they declared as a sale and what we know from other sources that their sales are at a minimum. And then they sent those guys also a letter similar to Chile, and they said, hey, look, you declared this amount. We know it's much bigger. In fact, it's that amount. Please rectify your tax declaration. Okay, that seems, if we got a letter like this in Switzerland, we probably be pretty sure to do that right away because we think that if we don't do it, the government is going to come after us. Now, what happened? What happened in Ecuador? So first of all, most firms did not respond at all. Now, that is rational for them to do. Why? Because so many firms have a discrepancy that it's clear that the government will not have the ability to audit each and every one of them who doesn't respond. That is not because of a failure of the Ecuadorian tax authority. That is because they are starting at a situation where it's a very low base. Right? It's much easier to go after a few cheaters if there are only a few cheaters, but if you're starting with many, many cheaters, it is really a difficult task for the Ecuadorian government. The second thing we saw is that of those who adjusted their revenue, those who adjusted, they actually did adjust, they did adjust, no, it doesn't work. To the right, you see, actually you can't see it here, but to the right, you see the revenue adjustment, and I'm just telling you, these adjustments are pretty much one-to-one. So if the government told the firm, there's like $950,000 missing, they added $950,000. These are large amounts, so they range between like $80,000 and like $1 million in not declared revenue, because they went after the big discrepancies. Now what happened though? Most of them adjusted also their costs, which you see on the vertical axis there, by the exact same amount, and in some cases to the cent. Okay. Yeah, I discovered another, $500,000 in revenue, but I also discovered another $500,000 in costs. Now, are Ecuadorian people just cheating more? No, it's just that they know that, in fact, now the government, to prove that those costs are not real, that is now very costly. The whole idea of this cross-check was government could do this automatically without an audit. Now you claim $500,000 in cost, government has to send somebody, they have to go through the books, takes months. Again, very rational for firms to think that the government will not have time for that. So probably to build this up, government has to start very small. Say we do 20 firms this year. And those 20 firms, if one of them doesn't respond, they get audited. If one of them does this adjustment, they get audited. Then word gets out that this type of message is very serious. Then maybe next year you can do 50. Because already 30 will have heard about this. And then you have to audit again 20. And you can slowly probably grow it over time. But you can't go, it's just beyond the capability of any government to move everyone from a low compliance level to a high compliance level. And also for the firms, if you're in a country where you think everyone else doesn't pay high taxes, you would be disadvantaged in the market if you pay high taxes, because now your costs are higher, maybe you can no longer compete. So you really, it's not that firms are less compliant intrinsically, it's the environment that is different. So some conclusions, therefore, is that it's very challenging to collect taxes because information is so low. Information collection is very important, is a very important ingredient, but it's not enough. If your government knows something but they don't have the credible power to enforce it, then it's not going to work. It's just going to sit there. So we need to, even though these new great electronic technologies are amazing and they can support the work of the tax officials, they cannot replace it. We still need to train and improve the government force and improve the systems on all these other parts of traditional classical tax enforcement. So as I said, building this deterrence power is a slow and gradual process. There's no panacea, there's no light switch. The good news is, though, as you build this third-party reporting, it's becoming more and more self-enforcing, like we've seen in Chile. Why? Okay, now imagine Michael hadn't paid taxes. Now he receives this message. Now he wants to declare more costs. Now he starts to ask me for receipts more, because he wants to do these deductions, right? And it's better to have deductions with a receipt, so you're protected in the case of an audit. Now suddenly there's more information in the system about me. Now I want to deduct more costs. Now I'm going to ask more receipts from my supplier. And gradually over time, the government will acquire more and more information until you end in a situation like Chile, hopefully. But it's going to take some time. Okay, another last point, a question that I often get asked. So what about taxation of multinationals? Can't we fix it all by just getting rid of international transfer pricing? We've all seen those headlines, right? Google, Starbucks end up paying taxes nowhere. Very important topic. Another topic that I'm in the middle of doing some research on. Again, though, I want to temper the hopes that this is another panacea that we switch on and we get rid of all the problems. Okay, first of all, it's very difficult. Even if you want to enforce this more, and imagine you had no political economy problems, everyone is very committed. There's two avenues to do this. One, where the OECD is going right now, is increasing more and more monitoring enforcement of whether firms are doing what they're supposed to do, which is the so-called arm's length principle, which is treating a subsidiary in another country as if it was a separate firm. And instead what firms often do is to underprice and overprice the transaction such that they shift all their profits into a tax paradise and pay very little or no tax. Now, as Europe knows, monitoring that is very, very, very difficult. Hence, you have Starbucks and the like paying very low taxes. So it, now imagine low capacity countries having to do that. It's very, very hard because I work with the governments, right? For every 5 lawyers the government has, the private sector has 200. Is a cat and mouse game. So another solution that's being discussed is, what if instead of this very complicated system, we have a different system where we're not requiring firms to do that, but we're taxing the global corporation together, and we're saying which percent are your productions in, which percent are your sales in, and so on, and we tax it proportionally, and there's no more of this monitoring required. Now, that will be a huge international negotiation, because it depends how you do this. If you say where your sales are, well, think about where the sales are. Not in Nigeria, in Germany. So then a lot of the tax is going to go to the rich countries. Is it where the production are? Is it where the natural resources are? So there's going to be a fight between rich and poor countries if you do this, how this apportionment is going to happen. And it's anyone's guess how much of negotiation power the poor countries would have and how much of this apportionment will really end up in the poor countries. So overall, it's challenging. And the last thing is just to keep in mind, taxation of multinational firms is essentially limited by how many multinational firms are actually active in developing countries, and it's not that high. So it will not be able to replace domestic resource collection and other sources. It's just there isn't that much of the cake in developing countries from those big multinational firms to begin with. But again, also an avenue that we should work on, not a panacea. So in conclusion, as we said, developing countries have much lower tax rate compared to GDP than rich countries. Many reasons: informality, limited government capacity, political constraints. So raising taxes just essentially is effectively much harder in developing countries. It just is. I mean, I admire all the people in the tax authority I work with, very dedicated people. A lot of progress has been made, but it's a huge challenge. The other thing to keep in mind is if you just start enforcing on a few guys that you have right there that you can catch, you may inadvertently hurt the development that you're trying to stimulate. So it's very important to also expand the tax base, which is even more difficult than enforcing on the guys who are already very formalized. So there are no quick and easy solutions, but governments in the South have made huge progress, have very strongly increased the tax collection, and so there's much potential to continue to do so without expecting miracles.
Okay, thank you very much, Dina, for giving us a lot of new insights and also some very concrete examples on how it can be done now in the case of transition countries, which seem to be a little bit more advanced in this respect. We are now getting to the last round of this keynote debate with a panel discussion. For that purpose, I would like to invite Mina Baliamoune, a Moroccan national. Actually, she is currently professor of economics at the University of Florida and works on international economics, economic policy, economic growth and development. Then, secondly, I would like to welcome Mark Herkenrath to the left of Mina. Mark Herkenrath, he is a professor of sociology at the University of Zurich, but actually his main profession is being the director of Allianz Süd. Allianz Süd is the umbrella organization of the large NGOs of Switzerland, and Allianz Süd is actually also a think tank of civil society organization and deeply involved in the whole policy processes on development. He was just on a panel with the deputy director of the World Bank on financing for sustainable development, I think 2 weeks ago, and made quite brave statements. We're looking forward to such statements again. And then last but not least, Heinzpeter Znoj. He's a professor of social anthropology. Actually, Michael Gerber, we just came across, studied once in a while with Heinzpeter Znoj. Heinzpeter Znoj, he knows, actually, he has a different perspective as many of us have. He is really working in the field, in villages, in touch with the actual development reality, and maybe he will give us a different perspective on the whole discussion. May I ask you to come in front, and then let's start the discussion. Free seating. Sorry about just cleaning up all the papers, which is a result of some improvisation. Okay, thank you very much. Again, I would like to start with a question to Mina Baliamoune. Actually, I think also Michael Gerber very much touched upon this, and some others also. What do you think? What is the actual role of future ODA in financing for development in specific, but maybe also going a little bit further, giving us some ideas what you think where ODA, the donor organizations, the international donor community will look like maybe in 20 years? What will be the focus of their work and orientation?
Okay, it's working. Thank you. First of all, I thank the organizers for including me in this panel. I think the question of whether ODA is still going to be here or what role it's going to play is an important question. But I want to first start by pointing out that even though the amount of money that official development aid today disburses, and I think the amount was cited as being close to $150 billion or around that number, it might look little. If you take all of the Western African countries, right, and take out the middle income or the ones that are not receiving concessional aid, which are Nigeria, Ivory Coast, they do a little bit of that, but they're not really a low-income country, and Ghana, and we take also out Cape Verde, which is part of West Africa. We're left with 12 countries. We take those 12 countries and add to them Ethiopia, a country with over 100 million people. In 2016, the total GDP of all these 13 countries is less than $150 billion. So it is a lot of money, even though it looks small compared to the amounts needed for to achieve SDH. With that said, we have to also keep in mind that there are countries that haven't even completed or achieved the MDGs. We don't talk about that. We just said we're switching to something else, SDGs. But there are countries, especially in Africa, that haven't achieved all the MDGs. Now, with that said, ODA is important. There was a time where people were doubting of its effectiveness, and that was legitimate because aid did not really work in some countries. And during that time, which was in the late 1990s, early 2000s, the idea was to make aid conditional on policy. But even that conditionality wasn't really, I myself and with other co-authors, we did work on whether really that the type of conditionality made lots of sense, and we saw that aid was effective in some countries, not regardless, but because of other factors that were not taken into account. But even with that conditionality, aid was disbursed to countries that violated even those conditions. So we know that the donors or the international community that was doing the official aid was not really fulfilling that conditionality or looking at it all the time. Now, aid has changed. I mean, conditionality or conditions have changed in many sub-Saharan African countries. For example, the macroeconomic policies are really good today compared to in the 90s and the 80s. So it should be effective, and we know that it is effective in many instances. We know that official development aid is needed. Now, the question is in which form it will be allocated in the future. And I think Michael talked already about some of the things that the international community is thinking about in terms of a partnership between public and private, for example. I think that's one way to do it, especially that even though some people believe that the effectiveness of private aid might be higher than that of the official development aid. I think combining the two is good, because also we have to keep in mind that even private sources, one has to doubt sometimes, why is it going to this country or this group of countries but not others, or to these projects but not other projects. So the partnership between public institutions or organizations and the private sources are important. Another development that we might see is really the focus of aid itself. Of course, in this case, we want to look at the SDGs or things that will allow the countries to reach SDGs. What we did not hear of, and it's not debated a lot, is we saw that list of the 12 subsectors, right? And then Michael talked about the 4 sectors that are important, which are cities, health system or healthcare system, energy and food and agriculture, which is all important. But the mechanisms to get there, how can we entice the private community itself or private donors to invest in those things? If you take them to countries where the skills are lacking, where women, we have a case of missing women in labor markets in many countries. How are we going to entice them to invest there? So those are the things I think that we're going to focus on in the future, or the international community will have to focus on in the future. I think I'm beyond my 2 minutes, right? Okay, thanks.
But a very substantial 3 minutes. Thank you very much. I would like to go on to Mark Herkenrath. Now, I think we heard quite some critical comments, or also something we have to reflect on by Mina, and now we heard also very promising statements that the private sector has an important role. There are many interesting funding instruments there. First of all, you believe in that, and second of all, if I know that you are slightly critical sometimes, what would be your favorite in terms on funding for sustainable development?
I was expecting a different question, but I will give a brave answer anyway. We're not critical of the private sector. We're very much aware that the private sector is the driving force of development, mostly the local, domestic private sector in developing countries. What is interesting to note, and here it's not a question of belief or ideology, is that most developing countries have a much higher rate of foreign direct investment when compared to their gross domestic product than, for instance, Germany or the United States. So to put it more bluntly, a larger part of their economy is controlled already by foreign investors, which may or may not be one of the reasons that corporate revenue ratios are lower, because we know that foreign investors have much better possibilities. You mentioned BEPS, base erosion and profit shifting, better possibilities to shift their profits out of the country. And that's one thing we're really concerned about. If we start mobilizing more direct investment into developing countries, how do we make sure that they will pay their taxes? And I think we really need to combine the two agendas. What I would challenge is the notion that we need a smart use of ODA in order to trigger more investment, private investment, to developing countries, because it's already there. As I said, the ratio is higher than in many so-called industrialized countries. So do we really need a smart use of ODA in the sense that it is used to mobilize private investment. I would challenge that notion because I think, as you just said, there is a role for ODA. When it comes to empowerment of people, it's not like development is just a technical issue. That is what we believed in the 1950s and 60s. You build infrastructure, then you have economic growth, and somehow automatically there will be more political claims and there will be this kind of like trickle-down effect. We learned in the 50s and the 60s that this is not the case. Development is a political process, and it's a struggle for power, actually. So we need to strengthen civil society in order to make sure that the people in the country make their governments responsible for development for the whole country. Now, when we talk about financing infrastructure, we're miles away from that kind of like political agenda. And I think effective ODA does strengthen civil society. It puts people in a situation where they can go and challenge their government, do development for the country. So when we use ODA to trigger private investment that goes into infrastructure, this whole political notion of development gets completely neglected. And who will make sure that once the infrastructure is there, people have access to the infrastructure? That's a highly political question, and we need to strengthen people to fight for their access to infrastructure, because it won't be granted by the government just because they're such nice people. So we need both private investment as well as ODA, as well as the political struggle for access to infrastructure.
Okay, thank you very much. Before giving then to Heinzpeter Znoj for his entry statement, I would like to invite Michael Gerber to briefly respond on this call and demand by Mark Herkenrath to make this kind of the ODA trigger on related to infrastructure and what it means also in terms of justice and access.
Thank you. Yeah, I actually agree with Mark, but I won't leave it there. I'm sorry. No. Of course, ODA has this important role. We heard that, and I will confirm that also in my keynote. ODA has a specific role in least developed countries, and we heard about Western Africa, but in general, it's 2/3 of the GDP of least developed countries that are really depending on ODA. So how do we use it, and how do we leverage additional investment by the private sector? I think the point is valid that you say ODA is not really needed to do that because investment is there anyway, but FDI are much lower in LDCs, that's one point, and then it goes anywhere. You don't control it. There is not necessarily a development outcome with these foreign direct investments. So therefore, I believe the partnerships, the public-private partnerships, are so important in this field, and there ODA can make a difference in terms of making governance right, looking for the rights of people, the involvement of civil society, etc., etc. That's what the public party brings into such partnerships, and it can try to incentivize investments in SDG-relevant sectors, and not just in infrastructure anywhere, for the purpose of some big players without any social outcome. And that's exactly what we try to do with Swiss International Cooperation and the platform I showed you in my speech with the social entrepreneurships in Latin America, where we really built a platform for local business actors to get an incentive and get more support also by other private investors to scale and to make a social impact or gain a social impact in the local business field. So I believe their development actors are still very important, but in partnership with private investors, and they can be foreign or local, this will boost development in the direction that we wish it to go.
Great, yeah. Going to chime in here as well. Obviously, we agree on a lot of things here, so I'm going to focus on the more controversial parts because we were encouraged to have a debate. So, one point with you that I agree, but in a different way maybe that you had it in mind, and another point about the foreign direct investment. So I agree very much on the issue of power and development. I want to turn around the lens though. Who is sitting at the podium here? We have one person from a developing country. We have 5 people from a rich country. In my opinion, this should be reversed. We start talking about political economy in developing country. Let's start with us here. Why is it that the experts are usually a white person? And then there's maybe somebody invited to provide the developing country perspective. Florida, and you're from Florida in addition, right? So there are multiple perspectives and many experts, and I would love them to be in the podium more often. So just to speak about power, we can maybe start with ourselves. On the foreign direct investment, so just to keep in mind, it's just mechanically the case that it's going to be a larger share in a poor country, because if you have the same amount of investment in Ghana that you have in Costa Rica, it's going to be bigger in Ghana because Ghana has a smaller economy. So that in part is mechanical. So then the question really comes down to, is this foreign investment providing positive benefits or not? And I think that's where the key is. Their views, okay, foreign direct investment is amazing, it's going to change everything. Their views of foreign direct investment is evil, it's going to take away power. My view is a bit more nuanced. We really need to make sure foreign direct investment is done within good frameworks and in a way that benefits the population. And I have a lot of friends who work for multinational firms in developing countries. Even if that firm pays no taxes, that firm pays that family's livelihood, that firm pays high school fees for 10 cousins. Right, so there can be many benefits, but, and that's where I come back to the ODA, maybe the way ODA can come in there is by putting that pressure to make sure that basic standards are respected and foreign direct investment is used in a way that maximizes local benefit.
Okay, thank you very much. I got the point about your critiques, it's well justified, but I would like to add, and maybe then also directly hand over to Heinzpeter Znoj. Actually, the representation here, and often in those conferences, it is not only about from transition or developing countries or industrialized countries, it is also about from what segments we are coming. And if we look at that, it looks even a little bit more critical, because we are belonging to a certain segment of society also. In this respect, this gives me also a good reason to go to Heinzpeter Znoj, because he is really working in the field, and he has most likely much more exposure to local livelihoods and realities. And in that sense, also the often heard call about unlocking private capital. The question is, how can this be achieved? But more so, from your perspective, what are the risks in that respect?
Yes, I do my research in Indonesia, in Sumatra on the one hand, and also in West Papua. And I think especially in West Papua, development is highly political. The investment of a lot of money by the Indonesian government, but also by private investors, attracts a lot of new settlers from other parts of Indonesia, and it puts the local population of the Papuans at a huge disadvantage. So it's no wonder that many Papuans resist the development process. They say, we don't want your development. Just go away with it. Development, even if it's sustainable development, it can disempower local populations. So I think democratic control of investments is very important, and I think there the risk of private investments is much higher than ODA, because ODA, at least there's a public accountability in the countries that pay for ODA, while in private investments the accountability is to the investors, to the private investors, and they may be more interested in profits than in what's really happening on the ground and whether the processes of investment, whether the local populations are anyway involved in that. So I think it's also a question of how transparent are these investments taking place. I just give an example of REDD plus investments in the province of Jambi. The Norwegian government invested $1 billion in creating these forest reserves for climate change mitigation. After 1 year of officially opening up this RED plus forests, the local population had no idea that it existed. So transparency, but at the same time, they were started to be excluded from access to these forests. And there are also private investors, and there the transparency is even less. So local populations just have to accept that sustainable development is happening, and they have to somehow adapt to everything. They have no control of the process. And I think in all these UNCTAD papers and WEF papers about sustainable development investment, the perspective of the local people really is lacking. It's just about the investor's interest and the definition of sustainable development. What sustainable development is really where the money comes from. And if the money comes more and more from the private sector, the definition of sustainable development will also be changed. I think we can see that in terms such as corporate social responsibility. I mean, the firms themselves say what corporate social responsibility is. It's not the people that are affected.
Okay, thank you very much. I think a very nice contrapoint in that sense, also showing about the concrete risks in real settings. I would like to, we are close to the end, 1 minute to go, and I don't want to compromise too much a coffee break, and not and even more so not the subsequent sessions. We got different questions, and I do not assign it to somebody, just make you visible if you would like to enter. Actually, it was towards Dina, but it must not be answered by her. One question which got a high rating is actually also, and the term was never used, which is also quite interesting, was about corruption. And the question is, in concrete, how do you ensure that tax authorities themselves aren't corrupt or become corrupt as they get more power? So the whole complex about corruption, which is a word I experience in the whole debates, which is not publicly raised. We speak rather from irregularities or deficiencies and this and that. Dina, what do you think about that?
So yeah, corruption in tax authorities is in some countries a very big problem. This electronic cross-checking type of monitoring actually can be a tool to help with that, because now there's external information. It's not so much discretion anymore of the tax official to do that. But that's partly also what I was saying, that the information collection cannot replace institution building. You need to have, at the end, a person who's actually going to enforce it. And as you all know, reducing corruption is a big, difficult task, and in tax administration, it's a very important one for that exact reason.
Yeah, but when Dina was talking about the case of Ecuador versus Chile, I was thinking actually of corruption. One way, because at the end, even with the electronic systems, what the tax authorities do is they send somebody, a finance inspector, to the firm to check things. This is how you know if the officials are corrupt or not. Once you have the information that came to you electronically, and you send the inspector to the firm, and they come back and they say, we checked everything, actually they have a cost that matches those revenues, and the tax liability is zero, then you would have wasted the money sending the official, wasted the money checking, and it's actually a lot more costly. So there is lots of work to be done to find ways to make sure that people do not cheat the system.
Okay, thank you very much. Just a very last question came in, or...
one more up here.
Okay.
The old way.
We are old-fashioned people sometimes, so but we like it to stick with the old way. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Thanks for very enlightening talks. I just, for curiosity, I'm Gurbir Bhular from FIBL, Research Institute of Organic Agriculture. I'm just curious about the numbers that we see here, so many billions or trillions of dollars in aid. Are these the numbers of the aid allocated to these countries, or are these the numbers of aid that reaches these countries?
Okay, thank you very much. A very clear and concise question. Yeah, now the big question. I think Michael and maybe we have two economists in addition who could hopefully answer this important question indeed. Michael.
He just made the sign that maybe I should give the unofficial answer.
It was transferred
start with the official answer, right?
No, I mean, it's actually the investment needed, you know, that's outgoing, you can say. But of course, there is the hypothesis behind that the money also comes where it is supposed to, or ends up where it's supposed to. And that's all the domains that I mentioned, infrastructure, etc. But also, of course, to the benefit of people and environment. That's at least the theory behind it. But we know the practice, and we've spoken about corruption. These are important issues. I think we haven't really spoken about illicit financial flows, which are a huge problem, because all the money that is actually going back from south to north. I showed you the graph with the 2.5 trillion gap, and a lot of it can be met with a potential contribution from the private sector, but there will still be around 0.7 trillion gap. And so if you take official development assistance, if you take the remittances, you can maybe make up also this gap, but illicit financial flows are about at this height. Now it's about 0.8, or I don't know the latest figures, but a trillion that leave developing countries. So that's a big issue.
Dina?
I totally agree with that. I just wanted to add to your question. Much of what's called official development aid never even gets to the developing countries, not to talk about flowing back or corruption, right? So one thing that I'm actually very concerned about that you also mentioned in your talk, Michael, is that this new practice to start deducting all the stuff about immigrant integration and refugee flows and calling that development aid, and now taking that away from money that's supposed to flow into developing low-income countries. But in addition to that, a lot of it goes to consultants and to conferences like these and to many beautiful things. And so my guess would be, but this is just off the top of my head, that less than half of that actual number ends up even ever touching the ground in the developing country.
Okay. Very last question. Could you introduce yourself briefly? Very short question.
Very short.
And then short answers from...
My name is Hamid Ali. I am Associate Professor at American University in Cairo. My question is for Dina regarding the value-added taxes. Recently in India, there is a goods and services tax was being introduced, and that's basically riding on the wave of the value-added tax by making the rate as a uniform across the goods and services. In your opinion, is this going to be the future, or any compare and contrast with the flow of this system versus the existing value-added system?
So what's potentially very promising about the new Indian tax is that it gets rid of a lot of barriers between the Indian states. So beyond the specific tax collection part, before that, when you cross the border, there was a lot of controls and checks to make sure you're now paying the right tax for the next state. And this is a little bit like trade liberalization now, right? Where you suddenly make it much easier to sell things from one Indian state into another. So I haven't obviously done the study yet, it's brand new, but I'd be very interested to see how much that actually helps increase productivity. And to the question about corruption, that now takes away one additional opportunity of corruption by this crossing the borders. So to the extent that we can, it's similar to the European Union, right? Take away borders by reducing the complexity of taxes, that has a big potential. We'll have to wait a few years to see how it materializes.
Okay.
In the break, maybe you can share me your experience. I would love to hear more about it.
Okay, thank you very much. You can hear me, or yeah, it seems so. We must conclude the session. First of all, thank you very much for being with us. And the good news is actually also that we have a second discussion, plenary dialogue as we call it, on the very same topic, where I think also now you can pick up from the different sessions issues which are in line or related to the whole financing question. I got 3 key messages out, and I will keep them very short. Maybe you will agree on it, but maybe also not. Let's see. First of all, ODA remains an important factor. However, how it will look like in future, nobody actually knows to answer at this stage. Whether ODA SDC is existing in 10 years' time, or maybe it disappears and we have just humanitarian aid. I don't know. Or also with GIZ and others. Then, second message, we need to empower civil society to hold their countries accountable instead of just channeling in finances for infrastructure without then also foreseeing who has access and where is the power and how the whole system changes. And then it is also related to that. ODA, given that it remains important, it must make sure that the money it leverages through FTA, that not only the risk is taken, but also that ODA need to guarantee accountability from the private sector. And this, of course, is a highly demanding task, and I think there is a lot to do, and we are just at the beginning. Okay, with that, I would like to end. I invite you to the coffee break. Thank you very much for staying flexible for all the changes we had in this meeting. Thank you very much for being with us.